You'd think 2024 was a dumpster fire at the box office, but let me tell you, some of those flops from the 2000s were way worse than that. Brendan Fraser gets stuck in horny cartoon hell. Jason Statham stars in Lord of the Rings ripoff funded by a German tax scam. And one movie tanked so hard it killed an entire studio. These are the most ridiculous box office flops from the 2000s nobody sane should have signed off on. This is what happens when a studio lets a tax scam masquerade as a movie. It started as a spec script back in the 80s, bounced around for years, and somehow made it to theaters with Antonio Banderas and Lucy Liu headlining. It's about two agents from different agencies who hate each other, but team up to stop a cartoonish villain with a doomsday device. The movie was funded by Franchise Pictures, a now infamous studio, run by Elie Samaha. And Samaha was not in the business of making good films. He was in the business of cooking the books. His whole thing was inflating production budgets, so his investors would cover most of the cost while he skimmed the rest. Ballistic ended up with a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's not hyperbole. 20 years later, still zero. Over 100 reviews, not a single one positive. The director didn't work again for 10 years, and Peter Lenkov, who did an uncredited rewrite, was so horrified he swore off film entirely and went straight into television. This one had no business being as bad as it was. Just look at that cast. Kurt Russell, Kevin Costner, Courtney Cox, Christian Slater. A group of Elvis impersonators robbing a casino during an Elvis convention. That should be fun. But behind the scenes, it was a disaster. Once again, Franchise Pictures was behind it, and once again they were playing games with the budget. They told their partners at Entertainment that the movie cost over $60 million, but in reality, it was closer to $47 million. The fake numbers let them offload more of the cost while lining their own pockets. Entertainment sued them for fraud, and when the smoke cleared, they won $77 million in court, and Franchise was dead. After filming wrapped, Costner and Russell both demanded the right to make their own edits of the movie. 2 versions were cut, and Costner's tested higher with audiences. That's the one that got released. Not that it helped. Brendan Fraser stars as a cartoonist who gets trapped in a twisted nightmare world after a freak accident surrounded by creatures of his own creation. Originally, it was supposed to be a Ben Stiller vehicle. He bailed to do Mystery Men, which suddenly looks like a smart move. The film was directed by Henry Selick, the guy behind The Nightmare Before Christmas. And at first, this was his weird little fantasy passion project. But everything fell apart once Fox chairman Bill Mechanic, the guy who greenlit the movie, got pushed out of the studio. The new leadership hated Monkeybone, hated the tone, and started chopping the movie to pieces. Selick lost control of it. The final cut was too bizarre and grotesque for kids and way too dumb for adults. It didn't fit any audience. Fox barely marketed it, dumped it into 1,700 theaters, and called it a day. And Henry Selick years later admitted he hated the final version and said he'd never touch live action again. This thing had a stacked cast: Warren Beatty, Diane Keaton, Goldie Hawn, Gary Shandling. On paper, it looked like a sure thing. But what actually happened was a slow-motion car crash that lasted 3 years. It started off simple enough. The script was picked up for what was supposed to be a $14 million movie. Then Beatty signed on, then Keaton, then Goldie. Suddenly the budget shot up to $40 million, and that was before anyone even looked at a finished script. Production started in 1998 without a locked screenplay, and everything went downhill from there. By 1999, New Line execs were already blaming Beatty for pushing the movie into production too early and refusing to give up control. The budget ballooned to $70 million. Beatty's lawyer responded to the criticism with a cease and desist letter, so that gives you a sense of how well things were going. Test screenings were a disaster. Reshoots got scheduled. The release date got pushed, then pushed again. By the time Town & Country finally limped into theaters in April 2001, it had missed 12 release dates, cost over $90 million, and had absolutely zero hype behind it. No big premiere, no press tour, the cast completely ghosted it. Even Beatty, who got paid $10 million for the movie, the biggest salary of his career, just shrugged and said, "It's not my fault." And then he disappeared from the screen for 15 years. At the start of the 2000s, The Spirits Within was supposed to change everything. First photorealistic CGI movie, huge voice cast with actual Hollywood stars like Donald Sutherland and Alec Baldwin, studio ambitions through the roof. Instead, it crashed so hard, it killed the company that made it. This was the brainchild of Hironobu Sakaguchi, the guy who created Final Fantasy. He wanted to bring his beloved game franchise to the big screen and turn CGI actress Aki Ross into a virtual celebrity. They planned to use her in multiple movies, completely digital, totally photorealistic. Square built an entire new studio just to make this film, Square Pictures. They set up one of the most advanced render farms in the world. 960 workstations rendering 141,000 frames. It took 4 years and 200 people to finish. And yeah, visually it was impressive for the time. People even praised how realistic the characters looked. But then came the box office. Spirits Within cost $137 million, over $220 million adjusted for inflation. It made just $85 million, and that was it. Square Pictures went under for good after this. In 1998, Sylvester Stallone signed on to do I See You, a horror thriller about an FBI agent dealing with PTSD after his wife is murdered, only to end up stuck in a rehab clinic where a killer starts picking people off one by one. It was meant to be the first in a 3-picture deal with Universal that guaranteed Stallone $60 million. Only one movie ever came out of that deal, and this is it. Filming wrapped in 1999, and early test screenings were so bad, Universal immediately delayed it and scheduled reshoots. Things got worse from there. Producers Ron Howard and Brian Grazer were so embarrassed, their company pulled its name off the film entirely. Then Universal just gave up. They let it sit on the shelf for 3 years, then dumped it off to DEJ Productions, Blockbuster's low-budget distribution arm. DEJ gave it a token release in just 78 theaters. It made $79,000 opening weekend. This was supposed to be Disney's big prestige project, Oscar bait. They were aiming for a Christmas 2003 release, total award season push. But the movie wasn't ready, so they shoved it into April 2004, right between Home on the Range and The Passion of the Christ. The thing is, the Alamo actually tried to get the history right. It matched the age of the real historical figures, and it showed the politics behind the battle, not just the heroism. The uniforms, the weapons, the way the siege played out, it's all way more historically accurate than what people are used to seeing. The Alamo opened soft, the reviews were mixed, and by the end of its run, it had made just over $25 million on a $107 million budget. Disney did not release their exact write-down on the picture, but it was estimated to be at least $80 million. This one came from Rob Cohen, the guy behind The Fast and the Furious. Sony gave him a massive budget, fast-tracked the whole thing, and dumped every marketing dollar they had to sell it as a summer blockbuster. Instead, they got a cheap-looking Top Gun knockoff. A lightning bolt hits a high-tech fighter jet, it becomes sentient, and now it's trying to start World War III. That's the plot. The timing couldn't have been worse. It opened right after the island bombed, which already had audiences running from high-concept sci-fi. Stealth got buried under Sky High and must-love dogs. And let's be honest, that's not the box office company you want to be keeping. The movie bombed hard, the reviews were awful, and Sony immediately canceled Cohen's next project, The Eighth Voyage of Sinbad, which would have starred Keanu Reeves. This one is legendary. It's based on a Ray Bradbury short story about time travel and dinosaurs, and it looks like it was made for $4. Originally, this was going to star Pierce Brosnan and be directed by Rennie Harlin. But then a writer's strike loomed, Brosnan bailed, and the whole thing got pushed back. By the time it came back together, Franchise Pictures was involved, which is always a red flag. Edward Burns replaced Brosnan, Peter Hyams stepped in to direct, and they somehow kept the $80 million budget, but with no studio left to actually pay for the visual effects. The movie sat on a shelf for 3 years before it was finally dumped into 800 theaters over Labor Day. The dinosaurs look like unfinished PlayStation 2 cutscenes. The time travel effects are laughably bad. Warner Brothers was contractually forced to release it, but they barely promoted it because they knew. They knew. If you're into so bad it's hilarious movies, this is a gold mine. This one starred Tim Allen, Courtney Cox, Chevy Chase, and still somehow flopped harder than anyone expected. Tim Allen plays a washed-up superhero who has to train a team of kids with useless powers. It's basically X-Men for toddlers, but way worse. And that wasn't just a coincidence. 20th Century Fox and Marvel actually sued Sony and Revolution Studios, claiming Zoom was a ripoff of X-Men, and that Sony intentionally scheduled it to open right before X-Men: The Last Stand to cash in on the confusion. Sony scrambled to tweak the script, pushed the release to August, and then quietly sent the thing out to die. They didn't even screen it for critics. When the reviews did land, it had a rare 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Here's a textbook case of a studio trying everything to save a sinking ship and just making it worse every time. Lucky you had a $58 million budget, a strong cast, Eric Bana, Drew Barrymore, Robert Duvall, and a respected director, Curtis Hanson. This is the guy who made LA Confidential, Wonder Boy's 8 Mile. So on paper, this looked solid. But the second they screened it, people hated it. Test audiences just did not respond. So Warner Brothers kept cutting it, re-editing it, testing different versions, half a dozen edits at least, and nothing worked. It previewed badly every single time. It got delayed again and again. Sat on a shelf for almost 2 years. Eventually, they gave up trying to build hype and just dumped it as counter-programming against Spider-Man 3. Which is insane. You don't put your mopey poker drama up against Spider-Man. The result was total bomb. It made $8.4 million on a $58 million budget. Some estimates say it lost Warner's up to $80 million. Okay, Jason Statham, Ron Perlman, Burt Reynolds, Ray Liotta as a wizard. That should be enough chaos already, but this thing was directed by Uwe Boll. Boll's whole film career was funded through this bizarre German tax shelter loophole. Basically, investors could sink money into his movies, and even if the films bombed, they got paid back through tax breaks. That's how stuff like House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, and Blood Rain got made. But In the Name of the King was the end of the line. This one had his biggest budget ever, $70 million. And once the tax shelter closed, Boll would actually have to sell movies like a real filmmaker. After this bombed, that wasn't going to happen. They booked it into over 1,600 theaters, released it in January 2008, and didn't even screen it for critics. And yeah, the reviews that eventually came out were horrendous. The acting was wooden, and the story itself is basically just Lord of the Rings if someone boiled it down to plot soup, forgot the flavor, and microwaved it. The Krugs are dollar store orcs. The plot makes no sense. The whole thing looks like it was shot for the Sci-Fi Channel in 2002. You can't get more pathetic than a grand total of $30 at the box office. Released in 2006, this thriller starring Katherine Heigl, Tom Sizemore, and Leo Grillo managed to gross $30. That's right, $30. Literally less than a parking ticket. Here's how that happened. The producers rented out one theater in Dallas for a week. One showing a day. No marketing, no press, no promotion. This wasn't meant to be a real release. It was just to fulfill Screen Actors Guild rules, which required a US theatrical run. They screened it for 6 people. 2 of them asked for a refund. One of them was the makeup artist. That's not a joke. The makeup artist had to buy her own ticket, then ask for her money back, and that's how this movie became the lowest grossing film in US history. So Universal drops $100 million on a Will Ferrell dinosaur comedy, and then watches it go full extinction event at the box office. Land of the Lost was based on the 1973 TV show nobody really remembered. But Universal bought the rights in 2005 and thought, hey, this could be huge. They wanted it to be a full-blown tentpole, with a budget of at least $125 million. But then Evan Almighty blew a crater in their bank account, so they slashed Land of the Lost down to a leaner $100 million. Then The Hangover happened, and Up happened, and Land of the Lost opened in 3rd place with just $18.8 million. Critics hated it. Audiences hated it. The cinema score was a weak C+, and word of mouth killed whatever shot it had. Universal had to write off at least $80 million. And even their own studio president, Ron Meyer, straight up said Land of the Lost was just crap. There was no excuse for it. We misfired. We were wrong. Okay, so the first Street Fighter movie back in '94 was already a disaster. But somehow, someone still thought, yeah, let's try that again. Enter the legend of Chun-Li, which somehow managed to clear even less of a bar that was already buried underground. Capcom wanted a comeback for the franchise, so they teamed up with Hyde Park Entertainment and threw down $50 million. Fox agreed to distribute it, probably with their eyes closed. They didn't even bother to screen it for critics. Andrei Bartkowiak directed it, the same guy who brought us Doom. So you can kind of see where this is going. The film was dragged to Cannes in 2007 for pre-sales, and then it just sat there until it limped into theaters in February 2009. Fox barely marketed it. They had taken still dominating the box office, and they clearly didn't want this thing messing with that momentum. So Chun-Li drops, no buzz, no hype, just quietly shows up on opening weekend and bombs. After this, Bartkowiak disappeared from studio filmmaking for almost a decade. When he came back, it was to make a low-budget movie with William Baldwin and Eric Roberts. So, yeah,